Welcome, family. This is your brother asarimhotep with the Madhu Andela Institute for the Advancement of Science and Culture, here with a very, very special show. It's an earlier show than we're used to, but given that our guest is, at least for us over here in the United States, across the waters, difference in time zones, so we adjust for our guest. And today is Tuesday, June the 9th of 2020. We are still in partial lockdown in the United States due to the coronavirus. So I hope that everyone is staying safe, still wearing your mask, even if you are out in the streets protesting or rioting at the moment. But beyond that, as usual, I like to acknowledge those who are catching us live. And then, of course, a shout out to everyone who will catch the archives. And so thanks to Brother Chavez, Kofi Kessie, Emmanuel Adama, and OG Gorilla, who are in the chat currently. And then, of course, everyone who is watching live via Facebook. And so we have Sister Mika. I see that you are back. Yes, I can see you. I know you were having some problems the last show, but I do see you. And Sarah Jehuti and everyone else. So, without further ado, today's special guest, we have with us Dr. SallyAnns Ashton, and I will just read her bio from her website. She has a BA in Ancient Greek from the University of Manchester and has a BA and MA in Classical Archaeology from King's College London. She remained at King's College to undertake research for a PhD in Egyptian archaeology. During this time, she worked as a researcher in the Department of Greek and Roman Antiquities at the British Museum in London, and later as a co-curator for the special exhibition Cleopatra of Egypt, From History to Myth. SallyAnns then moved to the Petrie Museum of Egyptian Archaeology, the University of College London, as a researcher. She was then appointed as senior assistant keeper in the Department of Antiquities at the Fitzwilliam Museum, University of Cambridge, with curator responsibility for ancient Egypt and Sudan until 2015. In addition to publishing numerous books and articles on a wide range of subjects relating to ancient Egypt and Sudanese cultures, Dr. Ashton has undertaken archaeological and anthropological fieldwork in Egypt, Sudan, Libya, Greece, Italy, and the Caribbean. Her most recent work has been on the history of African hair combs. And this is a little dated because she has since transitioned into the field of psychology and just completed her PhD in that. And so we will discuss that. So as I bring in our guest, you may unmute your mic. Dr. Ashton, how are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me on the show.
Thank you for being here. Thank you for being here. Been wanting to have a conversation with you for a minute, and so I'm kind of late to your website, which is, let me get it correctly, chemitexpert.com, which is a website blog where you discuss a lot of things about, ancient Egypt in particular. And a lot of the topics seem to center around the African-centered, approach to Egypt, as well as the concept of race and its inclusion in the study of ancient Egypt. So, but before we go there, since you are new to my audience, I want to kind of go back and ask you about, where you're from. How did you initially get into, Egyptology? What was your, your journey and motivation for that project?
I mean, I have a slightly unorthodox sort of entrance into Egyptology, which I think is possibly why I always looked at ancient Egypt slightly differently to some Egyptologists. So, as you said, I studied ancient Greek and classical archaeology initially, and I became very interested in the Ptolemaic period. So when I did my master's degree, I focused particularly on Hellenistic and Ptolemaic Egypt, and I decided I wanted to stay with that for my PhD. Whilst I was doing my PhD, because I wanted to understand the period from both a Greek and an Egyptian perspective equally, I spent a lot of time at University College London. My colleagues were extremely generous with their time, so learning Egyptian language, learning about Egyptian history, really catching up. And I stayed in that field. As you said, I became involved with an exhibition at the British Museum on Cleopatra, and then I worked at the Petrie Museum. And I think I was actually very fortunate because I ended up sort of in my first post as an Egyptologist at University College London, in the Institute of Archaeology and at the Petrie Museum. And at the time, we had a very forward-thinking director of the institute, Professor Peter Ucko, who actually organised a week-long conference called Encounters with Ancient Egypt, where people were encouraged to explore our relationship to ancient Egypt in a much broader context than Egyptology would normally entertain. So for me, I've always, as a classicist, I obviously viewed ancient Egypt initially through a Greek and Roman lens. It was a very different culture to the one that I was studying at the time. I remember going out to Egypt my first time backpacking with a friend when I was doing my undergraduate degree when I was 19. And it was a completely alien culture to me. It didn't make sense. It was just something completely different. So I think that reinforced that the ancient culture was completely different to the ones that I was studying at the time.
All righty. And so how did you come to the conclusion or come through the in terms of manner, in terms of process, looking at it from an African standpoint, in terms of the language, the culture, the artwork and things of that nature in relation to everything else? Because that seems to be, in terms of what we would call the mainstream of Egyptology, that they classify Egypt as part of the Near East. So it's always, the discussion is always Egypt in terms of the Levant, Arabia, and Greece, in that area. So what made you look into the African portion more?
Well, To be honest, I'd always seen it as African, and I think I was kind of blissfully unaware because, as I said, I was fortunate in terms of my first post to end up in quite in an archaeology, an institute of archaeology, with colleagues who looked at Egypt in its widest context, who didn't try to narrow how we view it. And it was only really, I think it was 2003, I was working at Cambridge University, and I'd actually been asked to go and present a lecture on my field work in Alexandria at a high security prison. And I remember, I've worked in prisons now for 18 years. That was my first time I'd been in a prison. And the teacher who picked me up at the stations, she said, well, you are looking at this as Africa. And I was like, well, yeah, of course I am. Mm-hmm. And she said, well, because she said, that's how they, my students see it. And I said, well, how else would they see it? And I remember her looking slightly confused. And then the first sort of interaction I had with one of her students was he came in the room and he said, ancient Egypt is African. I went, yeah, of course. And I think he thought I hadn't heard him properly. And he said, I said it was like African, as in Black African. And I'm like, yeah, and what's your point? And I think it was only really that after that experience that I thought, am I in some kind of bubble here or something? And so I started to actually look into the sort of background, really, the sort of, which we're starting to talk about it a little bit more in terms of colonial approaches, but still not directly the racism that Egyptology is founded upon. And at that point, it was almost like a sort of light bulb moment. I thought, well, why is this still the case when we, are we still stuck, 100 years sort of previously in this kind of racist ideology? Why is nobody challenging this? Because other disciplines had. So anthropology had looked very hard at itself in terms of looking at its colonial kind of past. It just seemed that Egyptology was kind of almost stuck there and it didn't really want to talk about it. So for me, it always was African. It was a bit of a shock to me when I actually started looking a bit deeper into this and then started having conversations with people and seeing how they responded to that.
Given that, this is still, even in 2020, a hot subject. Now, I don't know as far as like over there in Europe to the degree of it, but the United States is still very racialized and polarized along those lines. So we're still engaged in these rich debates on the Africanity and quote unquote blackness of the ancient Egyptians. In your opinion, what is the most healthy way to look at this, not necessarily problem, but this issue regarding not necessarily the race, because I don't want to use that term out of context, but the phenotypes and things, and especially in the context of, well, we know for a fact that the ancient Egyptians, had trade relations with, foreign entities around the Levant, and they have a particular, phenotype in that area, and of course Greece. And there's been interactions, movement in and out of the country since pre-dynastic times. So in terms of your opinion, the healthy way to look at that type of situation based on the evidence in which you've come across?
I think, the first thing I have to say is it's an emotive subject, isn't it, really? Or it's become one unnecessarily. I think the first thing is to open up that dialogue. And what I see a lot of times and it generally seems to end up coming back to race, and I'm with you that we shouldn't be focusing just on racialized identities. I see quite a defensive response from either individuals or from institutions, almost closing down the conversation, and that's not what needs to happen. In terms of looking at Egypt as a geographical place and the people that lived there. You know, I mean, all we have to do is look at a basic timeline to see that that has changed considerably over time, because, as you said, you get people moving into the country, bringing new cultures, new language, new people. And I think it's important that we keep that timeline in mind, and also make a distinction between contemporary Egypt and an Egypt of 2,000, 4,000, 5,000 years ago. I think that's a really important distinction to make. We used to have quite interesting conversations when I was working at the Fitzwilliam Museum, particularly around when we had exhibitions. So we did the East African headrest exhibition, we did the Origins of the Afro-Comb exhibition. And our demographic really for that museum was predominantly white, middle-class British people, who often hadn't even thought about the concept of, you know, what is ancient Egypt? You know, where does it kind of belong? Where does it fit? And it was really helpful to have a dialogue with members of the communities who had a direct connection to Egypt and more broadly to Africa as part of the diaspora, and to look at evidence and to have those discussions. And I think what I don't see, and this is what I see, I personally feel is extremely problematic, is the kind of almost shutting down of those conversations by either institutions or by individuals. And I think, you know, we really need those conversations to happen.
Indeed, indeed. So you mentioned, well, I read about the combs, and you just mentioned the hair expedition. Like, what have you learned as a result of curating that exhibition? Like, what is the relationship, you know, between the combs and possibly even the identity of the people who use them in that time period of ancient Egypt?
I think one of the interesting things was that the combs, as indeed, you know, the population changed over time. So the combs responded to changes in hair type. And, you know, I mean, the artifacts don't lie. This was why I guess I was always more comfortable with archaeology rather than other aspects of ancient Egypt. And they didn't really make sense outside of an African context. So we didn't have any combs. And even Petrie, when he was categorizing these combs, actually said, we don't have combs like this from Europe. These combs are different. So that was a really helpful starting point. But I think also, you know, I think part of the problem with studying a culture that no longer exists is that we can project anything we want onto that culture. Now, you know, we know that we all project onto sort of when we look at things, particularly if we're researching. Social scientists are very aware of this, and they always talk about their identity before they write, and something that we don't do in Egyptology. And I think the comb project was really important because it was a community-based project. We had a community committee, so I worked equally and closely with that community committee, and actually they had the final say over you know, sort of which combs were exhibited. We had a huge choice of combs from different museums, but the important thing was that we were able to contextualize it, and people were able to relate directly to it in terms of their own stories and items that they had at home still. So for me, that was a really helpful way of kind of starting to bridge some of these gaps, because it was an item that meant something to people today, that was contextualized within an African context, but actually also changed over time. I think equally, it also showed that we need to look to other African cultures in order to understand objects, because, as I've said, I couldn't find parallels for those objects outside of other African cultures, whether it was West Africa, East Africa, or Central Africa. And I think that was really important to accept and to realize.
You come initially from a classics background, and within that field of study and conversation, you came into Egypt. What can we learn about Egypt from the Greeks? What was their perception of these people in the Nile Valley, and what was primarily their relationship in the late period?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that, you know, the people, you know, the sort of the philosophers, the historians, the scholars, effectively, who went to Egypt, who had contact with Egypt from Greece, you know, were more than happy to say that that's where they'd gone, and it seems that Egypt was seen as this older civilization, which clearly it was, much older than sort of classical Greece, when people started to interact with it. And it was different. The people there were different. So you often get the term for Ethiopian, you know, which is Greek for burnt face, used interchangeably when we see representations of the people from Egypt. They don't look like the Greeks. They're different. So the Greeks are very aware of this kind of this difference between the two cultures, and certainly that was something that continued into the Roman period as well. So I think for me, this is why I was so shocked initially, because I had been introduced to Egypt through the lens of Greeks and Romans. So that's why I was so shocked that it was somehow almost, you know, people were advocating for ancient Near Eastern or a European sort of origin to this culture that was very strange to the Greeks and Romans. It was different.
In your study of ancient Greek society, you know, you have a few, you know, authors who give, you know, physical descriptions of the ancient Egyptians and Ethiopians. Do you find similar descriptions of people in what we would consider the Near East? Did they have those type of conversations in terms of the need to even describe them, you know, in terms of their hair texture, in terms of their skin color, of those people in that region versus in ancient Egypt? And if not, what do you think is the reason for that?
I think it's a really interesting question. I've never really looked at ancient Near Eastern identity, or the sort of how it's described. And I think the fact that I'm not aware of it suggests that it wasn't seen to be as different. And I think the other thing I would add to that is just looking at how the ancient, the Kemites, the ancient Egyptian people, depicted people from that region. They're the only people that have a different complexion to the other Africans, so the Libyan, the Kushites, and the Kemite people. So they seem to be different. I think the one thing that I will say is that Egypt seems to be the place that the ancient Greeks certainly, and then actually the Romans also go to again to look. It's almost because it's this older culture. They go there to almost kind of learn, and that makes perfect sense because, of course, you know, when we have classical Greece, that's in the late period, what we classify as the late period in ancient Egypt. So they seem to have recognized it as ostensibly different, and older, and somewhere that had knowledge. But I think it's a really interesting question. How did they write about the ancient people that would be considered quote unquote ancient Near East? And I think that's something I'd have to have a look at. I think it's a very interesting question.
Yeah, because my assumption is we know that they had interactions with them. They even got their script from, you know, the Levant area. But if they didn't describe them physically in terms of like their hair color, texture, and skin color, the assumption is that they didn't need to, because they look more like them. But when they came into Egypt, it was such a contrast that it was worth noting, that, their physical, even their, we know that the culture and stuff is different, but even their physical appearance is drastically different than us. So we have to note this. So I always wondered, because I don't read as much Greek material as I do just other African material, but that is something that I've just always wondered. Is there any of those descriptions for those people in the Near East along the same lines?
Yeah, and certainly in what we call the geometric period, there's a lot of influence in terms of, designs on pottery from those kind of regions. I think it probably speaks volumes, though, once we kind of move into the classical period, that actually we have depictions that we recognize as people from the continent of Africa, and the people that they had contact with. And they're always shown in almost an exaggerated way to distinguish them from themselves. And that first appears, and those references kind of first appear in the classical period. But of course, they're influenced much earlier by the statuary, the sculpture from archaic Greece.
All righty. Now, sticking with Greece at the moment, I recently purchased and have read just into the second chapter. Your book from 2008, it is, I cannot speak at the moment. It is, I believe, Cleopatra.
Oh, yeah.
Egypt. And if you could tell us a little bit about that text, like what are you, what's the main thrust in conversation in that particular text?
Well, the book was written really as a response because Cleopatra had only really been kind of studied in any detail by classical scholars. So a lot of her Egyptian representations were largely ignored, actually, simply because the people that were looking at the material couldn't read, didn't understand the art and her representation. So it was really a way of situating Cleopatra back into Egypt, rather than looking at her solely in terms of her relationship to the Romans. So that was why I decided to write the book. And it was after I'd done a lot of research for my PhD, and also I'd been involved in curating the exhibition that was in Rome, London, and Chicago on Cleopatra.
Indeed. Now, there's been a lot of, at least in times past, I haven't really heard too much lately on whether, Cleopatra, was an Egyptian, or was she, a Greek? And I know you discussed, at least in summary, that part in the first two chapters. But can you, kind of give some context on the nature of that debate and why it is even a debate in the first place?
So Cleopatra's family had been in Egypt for about 270 years by the time she came on the throne. She's descended from a Macedonian Greek family, but we also know that we don't know the identity of her grandmother. So her father was illegitimate. We know that he was actually called a bastard in Greek, nothos. And so it wasn't actually me who suggested this. It was actually somebody else suggested, a papyrologist suggested that, Cleopatra's grandmother, if could have been Egyptian. And so if she's Egyptian, then that means that Cleopatra is partly Egyptian. And I think it's really important. Certainly I hadn't realized it was going to be such a contentious kind of issue. Actually, people seem to respond to this very badly. But there's been other research elsewhere. It was believed that the skeleton of Cleopatra's sister, Arsinoe, was also found in Turkey, and that actually she was of mixed heritage, mixed African and European heritage, which actually ties in with the idea that so was Cleopatra, the final Cleopatra, the one that we call Cleopatra the Seventh. I think I was very surprised at just how strongly some people responded and reacted to that suggestion.
Now, on your blog, you had a conversation. We recently had, well, on here twice, Dr. Shamarka Keita. And, of course, he's originally from the United States, but he studied, you know, in London.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, he responded to this particular study that came out in 2017 concerning Abu Sir, and you know, and I know you have a response, you know, on your website, you know, about it. So, you know, given your knowledge of that particular study, in terms of method, you know, what are your issues with that particular study?
I think the same as everybody else's issues, and actually they were listed, you know, in sort of limitations. You know, it's sample size. I mean, yeah, I sort of I know Dr. Keita very well, and we invited him when I was working in Cambridge to come and talk about his work, because I was really keen to hear what he had to say about DNA sampling and testing. And I think, like a lot of people up until that point, I had perhaps naively thought that, you know, this is how we can answer this issue over racialized identity once and for all. But as he pointed out at the time, and on my blog, I actually refer to the talk that he gave in Cambridge. So I think it's very helpful in terms of explaining what the issues and the problems are around DNA and sampling. And certainly since I moved into the social sciences more recently, I can see that, you know, a lot of these studies are extremely problematic in terms of where they're sampling from, in terms of the sample size, and also, you know, how the data set that they're actually being compared to. And I understand that, you know, it's costly and difficult to get samples, particularly if you're taking samples from human tissue. But I think, you know, the problem that I have with this is that these studies that actually list the limitations that they have in their academic publications are picked up by extremist groups and used as evidence, quote unquote evidence, and they seem to grow a life of their own. Now, I would say to the authors of those papers, you know, if my research was being used by extremists to tout a racist ideology, I would respond to that, and I would object to that. And I would say to the authors, why are you not doing the same?
Indeed, indeed. Now, you mentioned, well, first of all, let me ask this question that someone asked. So, you know, my audience is a mix of folks, some very knowledgeable in the field and others not so. So this person asked, are there different Cleopatras, and what does the name mean? Going back to the Cleopatra conversation.
Yeah. So in fact, there are a lot of Cleopatras, and this is where it kind of gets very confusing. The Cleopatra that's the famous one that everybody knows about, we call Cleopatra the Seventh, but she is in fact Cleopatra the Sixth, we believe, because she was counted. One of the Cleopatras was counted twice. And in actual fact, in all honesty, when I was doing my doctoral thesis and subsequent research, she was actually the Cleopatra I was the least interested in, because everybody was writing about her, and I was actually more interested in an earlier Cleopatra, Cleopatra III, who ruled with her sons, as indeed the final Cleopatra did. So in the Ptolemaic period, it's quite confusing. All of the rulers have the name Ptolemaios. They're then given a cult name. There are 15 of them in total. And for ease, we call them Ptolemies 1 through to 15. And in terms of the females, the key names that you get are Arsinoe, Berenike, and Cleopatra. So it can be quite confusing in terms of the number of Cleopatras. Everybody's seems to be only really interested in the last one. And certainly by that time, culturally, her dynasty were very Egyptian. They would still present themselves as Greeks because they were Greeks, but they fully embraced, from really after about the first 100 years, they fully embraced Egyptian culture.
Someone has a follow-up question. Trying to see if it comes up. Could the name Cleopatra, and even Ptolemy, I would add, be a title reference? Is it?
No,
is that an actual name?
They're names. They're actually names. Yeah. Ptolemaios, the original Ptolemaios, was one of Alexander's the Great's generals. And after Alexander's death, when the kingdom became divided, Ptolemaios took control of Egypt.
Alrighty.
Yeah.
It's almost, hold on. Now this is a totally different question, but someone, D Bags from Facebook, is asking, is there any evidence that Osiris existed as a real life person? I guess the god Osiris was Seer.
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, he appears in mythology, as do all of the ancient Egyptian deities.
All right, no problem. So I'm gonna transition a little bit out of the Egyptology into psychology.
Mm-hmm.
And you recently completed a PhD, relatively recently completed a PhD in psychology. And so the question is, of course, I'm pretty sure everyone's wondering, how do you go from Egyptology to psychology? That seems, I guess fundamentally there's some aspect of overlap, but two different fields nonetheless. So what inspired the transition? And in what area focus of psychology, is your center in terms of
so I'm actually an investigative or a forensic criminal psychologist. So yeah, I'm a criminal psychologist. I actually specialize in gangs. That's where I do most of my research now, and also juveniles. So the transition started back in about 2006, 2007. I had been delivering programs in prisons after that first visit, working with prison education departments, exploring how the museum could be brought into prisons, how it might work in terms of rehabilitation programs, people exploring their identity. And I wanted to be able to evaluate that effectively, and I felt I didn't have the necessary skills to do that with my PhD in Egyptology. Mm-hmm. And so I did an MPhil, my second MPhil in criminological research at Cambridge, and I looked specifically at the impact of cultural heritage programs on the self-concept of Black British male prisoners. That was the title of my dissertation. And I was working in prisons. I had a sabbatical from the museum to work in prisons for 2 years during that period. I then went back to the museum. I continued working in prisons. and looking at how we could use African history to explore ideas around racism and stereotyping of Black prisoners, Black British prisoners, also prisoners from mainly West Africa and the Caribbean. And I did 3 more research projects at the museum. I did a project and an exhibition on East African headrests. I then did a research project on Nubian identity, and then did the hair combs project. And during that time, I did a 3rd master's degree in investigative forensic psychology. And I decided that I started to feel as if I wasn't a very good fit anymore for my role as a curator. That I didn't want to be restricted by just researching ancient Egypt alone, that I needed to expand that research, both in terms of undertaking anthropological research, looking for parallels, as I was describing with the Combs project. And I think also fundamentally for me, I realized just how restricted Egyptology really is. That unlike the social sciences that I was retraining in, the only framework that I could find was this kind of embedded framework from the start of kind of colonialism and racism. And I started to find this really problematic. It's like, how are people actually working in this field without acknowledging a framework or working to a model or a framework? Because I'd suddenly been taught that that's what we do, that's how we approach, research in an effective and comprehensive way. So I think it was 2 things really. I became very disillusioned, I think, and disenfranchised with Egyptology as a discipline, and my research interests were just growing outside of that sort of very restricted area. So I decided that I would resign from my post at the museum and complete my PhD. And now I work as a university lecturer in my new field.
Now, I wonder to what degree your background in archaeology helps you, or if it influences at all, or helps you in terms of this kind of forensic psychology. Is there any overlap that you see, with that, at least in terms of method?
Oh, it's quite interesting. When I did my 3rd master's degree, as part of the examination for the course, we had to present something on an aspect of forensic science. So I actually chose to do some research and a presentation on forensic archaeology, looking actually at one of Petrie's early publications of the First Dynasty sites, where he claimed, with considerable detail, that people had been murdered. He claimed that one person, if I recall, had been hit over the head with a sandbag, and how he knew that, I have no idea, because we just had the skeletons in the ground. So I actually went back and looked at that analysis, actually under the lens of forensic archaeology, because I wasn't a forensic archaeologist, I was a classical archaeologist. So, but I think certainly when I was working as an archaeologist, and certainly when I was at the Institute of Archaeology at UCL, again, there was this idea that we need to work to frameworks or models. We need to somehow situate what we're doing within a framework. And Egyptology just doesn't seem to subscribe to that. So yes, I think you're probably right. I think my early training in archaeology was probably a precursor, if you like, to moving sort of further into the social sciences and away from Egyptology.
All right. So what has, well, I should ask, what was your dissertation on for your psychology degree, and what have you learned thus far in terms of, I'll hold that question depending on what you say. Okay. For the first one. So go ahead. I'm sorry.
So second PhD dissertation looked at social and psychological risk factors that are associated with offending in groups and gangs, and their relationship to desistance or stopping crime. So I was interested in why people get involved in groups, how they get involved in those groups, and how they leave, and what impact it had on offending. So that's what my dissertation was on. And as part of that, more recently, I've been looking at sort of exploitation and grooming and extremism and vulnerability, particularly of young people, to becoming involved with crimes and being coerced and involved with crimes that way.
So this isn't necessarily focused on any particular quote unquote racial group.
No.
It's just the, and I'm pretty sure that may be a factor in some analysis, but it's mainly just why do, or I guess one of the central questions is, why do people form gangs, I would assume, and get into the, and more so in the criminal, aspect to it. So to my next question would be, to what degree is the role of the larger culture play in the development of gangs? Like, have you compared and contrast societies where there isn't necessarily a large gang presence versus the ones that do, and to what degree does the culture play in the development or absence in large numbers of these, the formation of gangs?
Well, I think because some of this kind of creeps into social psychology, doesn't it? Sort of in and out groups, and we see a lot of this, playing out in comments and responses to websites. I'm sure you'll be familiar with them. To websites that are discussing African-centered approaches to Egypt. I think, I directly asked the question, not so much in terms of gangs, but certainly in terms of offending to the people that I've worked with in prison, because within the English prison system, I've worked pretty much, not exclusively, but predominantly with men and women who would be racialized and ethnicized as Black British, for want of a better term. And I've actually asked people as part of research when I did my second master's degree, what impact does having a restricted access to a restricted identity almost? Because I think when we look at Black history or African history, traditionally it is restricted. And, I know for years when I would say to people, yeah, I research Black history, and they would instantly assume, oh, so you do slavery? No, I don't. I actually do ancient Egypt. That's not the area that I specialize in. People were like, oh, so there's more to Black history? And that was, often that was white people who were racialized as white were saying that. And then we'd have the conversation, well, yes, actually, there's a lot more to Black history. But the reason I'm mentioning that is because it's not only about what an individual understands about their background, their history. It becomes about a social identity and how people view a particular group of people. And I think that this restriction on just looking at certain aspects of the history of Africa and its diaspora, and Africa, of course, is a huge continent. It's lots of different cultures. It can be really problematic in terms of not only how people perhaps view themselves and their potential, but also how their cultural group is viewed by others in terms of restricting them as well.
So you're saying, to a degree, I guess this would be a two-part question as well. So the first part of the question being, the role of marginalization in society to the formation of these, gangs or particular social units. And then I assume, of course, that poverty must play a role in that. And then on the flip side, is there any analysis on more organized, what we call, I guess, organized crime? And if, because that would be a little bit more, I guess, considered affluent
Mhm.
type of crime or whatnot. But, are there similarities in the formations and perspectives of these particular groups, if at all? I don't even know if you've looked into like more so organized crime, from like a like a mafia type standpoint,
Mhm.
and that being considered along the same lines as gangs, uh like we would consider gangs, in that context. So
Yeah, I
hopefully
mean,
I'm making sense and not just rambling. But
yeah, you are.
okay, okay.
There's there's two ways I'm going to respond to that.
Okay.
First of all, the majority of people spend, research has shown that people spend maybe 1-2 years in a gang, and then they leave, for a number of different reasons. Some individuals stay in gangs, and some then move into what we would consider more organized crime.
Mm,
And we know that the individuals that remain, now I'm not saying that one is causal, one way is causal the other, but the individuals that remain in gangs, and continue to behave and offend, have very different traits to those who leave. So they would score higher on psychopathic traits. They are exposed to more violence, which in turn can cause more trauma. They use more drugs, which again can impact on, if we're talking about younger people, can impact on the development of the brain. So they're different. What I do see is adult gang members, whether they are street gangs or whether they're more organized, grooming and involving young people in criminality in the same way that people sexually exploit children and young people. The process is exactly the same. It's grooming, and it's so if people are feeling that they don't have any future, any legitimate means of making money, if they have certain risk factors that adolescents may have, for instance, not able to control their impulse, and that will naturally develop over time, they therefore get excluded from school, they seem to be difficult. That therefore makes these young people highly vulnerable. But the one thing I will say, certainly in Britain, I don't want to link gangs with African or Black culture in any way at all. The majority of our gang members are white; they are racialized as white, and certainly I looked at a US data set. I used a US data set for my PhD, my second PhD. And again, the majority of gang members that were in the data set were not racialized as Black.
I wonder, going back to ancient Egypt, and not even necessarily just on Egypt, but if there's any kind of link. I don't know if anybody has ever thought of this question, but in terms of empire and state formation and whatnot, could it be linked in some ways to like gang like activity, wanting to take over? Like, could you consider it within the same universe as, like people who start a gang? And so you have some, in modern times that, they may have petty crimes, deal drugs, but then other gang members, you know, uh, want to start empires in countries and things. And like, how do, if that is even relatable, like how could we reconsider or reanalyze, like, for example, the formation of the United States, and like, could we consider those founding individuals, gangs, and like the first, like if we look back at Narmer, or the pre-dynastic, like were they really like gangs, like, herders, and then it just kind of over time formed into a country, like I don't know. I don't know how to formulate the question, but I was just thinking about that as you were speaking, in terms of scale.
I quite like the idea of a Nama gang. I think if I was going to have a gang, I quite like that. No, I think looking more broadly, so gangs are kind of an extension of, if we look at it from a social psychological perspective, of in and out group. So you're in a group, and within that group you share similar philosophies, you share similar lifestyles, similar attitudes, and what happens is you reinforce not only your group identity, but your sense of self-identity by belonging to a group that affirms everything that you're about. And in that respect, yes, of course, that's human beings throughout. I mean, every single one of us belongs to an in group. Some of those groups we choose to belong to. I don't know, even if it's as simple as, a kind of a soccer team or something like that. But there are other groups we're placed into by society, because of our gender, because of our appearance. So we can't, we can't decide some of the groups that we're placed within by society. But absolutely, it's something that human beings do naturally. They sort of cluster in groups of like-minded individuals because it affirms to them that actually they're right.
Like I think about that in terms of, like when I think about, like when I read a lot of stories, especially in Africa, it's always like this infighting between, like royal brothers or something. This could all be myth, but even still, one brother leaves with a certain amount of people, then they start their own, territory. And then ultimately, like when they get some numbers, then they start fighting. And then the empires, and it's always kind of like that when you're reading these stories about kingship or kingdoms, so to speak. And then I think about, like, here in the United States, like when I think about like the Crips, who started out in LA, gang, the Crip gang, who, they had good intentions at first, but the guidance wasn't there because the Black Panthers had been, as a result of COINTELPRO, dismantled. So you had this young energy wanting to get involved and help protect themselves and create an organization to protect themselves against white hostility that was happening in LA. But again, not having that guidance, they kind of drifted into something else. And so I'm seeing this in terms of protection. I don't know if that comes up in your analysis, but them coming together to protect themselves in some way.
I think what's
in the environment.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting about gangs is that the majority of young people in qualitative research actually cite protection as a reason for joining the gang. So they want to be protected by the group. But equally, 1 year down the line, 2 years down the line, they actually cite sort of exposure to violence and lack of protection as being the reason why they leave. So it's a bit of a sort of, obviously, they become involved and it's not as they imagined it was going to be. It's also true that, we have kind of world leaders who behave in that way, sort of, taking people off on a tangent somewhere. And so, yeah, I think, it's this idea of kind of in and out groups is something that's core to human beings. Absolutely, it is.
All righty. I have I'm gonna go back to Egypt on you real quick. And someone asked a question: if you were familiar, I'll just tag it real quick so everybody else can see. Are you familiar with the work Stolen Legacy by Dr. George G.M. James? And how credible was the research in your opinion, if you are familiar with that work?
I am familiar with it, but it's quite a number of years since I read it. I think my problem with that work is the lack of references in it. This is kind of me speaking as an academic. But also, I feel it's extremely important if we're trying to resituate Egypt, then we need to really back up our evidence when we're doing that, because as we know, as I know, you are going to meet resistance by trying to reframe Egypt in a different way. So for me, and it must be about 3 or 4 years since I last looked at that book, it's my issue with it was actually the lack of referencing. There was a lot of opinion in it. And there weren't enough references to other people's work, either critically referencing those works or supporting those works.
Indeed, indeed. So we have this question. Have you done much research on the civilization further south, I assume of Egypt? So, and why is it showing up halfway like that? Let me, well, hopefully you see the question or heard the question.
Yeah,
so go
absolutely.
ahead.
So yeah, about probably about 8 years ago now, one of the projects I did when I went back to my role as curator after I'd had a sabbatical was to really look at Nubia in the kind of broadest sense. So look at that region, look at contemporary Nubian identity, and also look at how that related to the past, so monuments of the past. And so I spent time in Aswan at the Nubian Museum, and also in northern Sudan, Nubia that is in northern Sudan, with my colleagues at the National Museum in Khartoum, and visiting the kind of Nubian sites, and actually talking to Nubian people through a translator, and sort of exploring how contemporary Nubian identity related to the past. So most of my research in that region has been more kind of anthropological rather than archaeological. And there were a series of kind of footage and images and quotes from people that are on the Fitzwilliam Museum website.
All righty. We have a question coming from Facebook. And so let me read this correctly. If the Egyptian civilization is African at its base, as demonstrated by Sheikh Anta Diop in 1974 in the Cairo Symposium, with the Macedonian and Roman invasions, can we consider that the invaders were rulers of Egypt in the African sense of the term? I asked the question when we study characters like Cleopatra. Indeed, I'm not sure what you're asking specifically. If you can reword your question, Jehuti, Kim Meshawar, if you're listening, I'll re-ask it in the way that you did, but asking, could we consider the foreign invaders rulers in the African sense?
So the Ptolemaic period is very different to the Roman period. So in the Ptolemaic period, you have rulers who are present. They are living in Egypt. In the Roman period, things are very different. There are only 3 Roman emperors who ever set foot in Egypt. And Egypt, you had to ask the permission of the emperor to visit Egypt as a Roman citizen, because they were actually concerned about revolts there. So the Ptolemies, as I said earlier, initially were obviously Greek. They developed the city of Alexandria on the coast. But some research I did probably about 20 years ago now, and again, this is just a case of classicists, Egyptologists not looking at Alexandria, and classicists ignoring all the Egyptian material. Even the early Ptolemaic city was very Egyptian in terms of its appearance. And there's a reason for this. So initially the Ptolemies were quite strong. They then grew extremely weak. And we know that from things like the Rosetta Decree that was under the reign of Ptolemy V. And they started to have to rely, particularly in the southern regions, they had to rely on the power of the extremely powerful Egyptian priesthood. So I think this is probably why we have so many purely Egyptian style temples throughout Egypt during the Ptolemaic and the Roman periods, because actually it's a way that the rulers were giving money to the Egyptian priesthood because they needed their support. And we do have examples in the early Ptolemaic period of indigenous rulers coming back to save Egypt. There are accounts of this, and to take back Egypt from these people that had landed there and taken over control. So I think the Ptolemies had they embraced Egyptian culture. Were they all powerful? No, not at all. And I think the sheer volume of temples that were produced during that 300-year period is testimony to the fact that they really needed to almost be buying, I guess, the priests' acceptance, because the priests were very powerful. They were an elite class and they were extremely powerful. Does that answer the question, sort of?
I think so. I'm waiting because we're going to have a slight time delay from when we're speaking versus when they hear what it is. So sure. Hopefully the person hears it and still listening and responds
right.
To that. So we have this question here. And why is it coming up halfway on here? Do you know the name of a group pharaohs of Ta-Seti before Kemet?
No.
I'm not sure anyone knows
no.
That information.
Not yet, anyway.
All right. Hold on. What are some important studies that you feel that, you know, those really interested in a deep understanding of Egypt in its African context, like, do you have any recommended works or at least authors that, you know, you would recommend that this audience, you know, catches up on and reads? Like what text? I'm sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, M.P. Kamboli's work on evil, the concept of evil in ancient Egypt, is really, really interesting. I'm
trying to get in contact with him. I have that text too. It's a blue book.
I can get in contact with him for you if that helps, because I am in contact with him quite a lot.
I appreciate it. Yes,
absolutely.
Please.
He'd be great to speak to on the show. I really like Professor Karenga's work as well, around Ma'at. I like the way that he contextualizes it. And again, this is somebody who has, you know, invested in two different sort of disciplines. And I heard him speak. I was very impressed. and I really enjoy his books. So maybe those might be two authors that people may or may not, on obviously in addition to the usual works that people will be more familiar with.
All righty. Highlight this question from this slipped. Would you categorize, in your view, the Ptolemies as settler, colonialist, kind of like we see in Canada, U.S., South Africa, etc.?
No, and the reason I say that is because they really embrace the indigenous culture, and that's, you know, all of the countries that you've just cited, the settlers didn't do that. You know, they tried to erode the indigenous culture. They denied it or tried to erode it. So no, I think there is a difference, and I see the Ptolemies very much embracing. So by the end of the Ptolemaic period, in fact, even from about halfway through, we don't actually have many Greek-style representations of the rulers. They want to be seen as Egyptians. I think that's an interesting, question.
It to me, it's just one more bit of evidence on the power and influence of ancient Egypt.
Yeah.
In that area, to where you're the colonial force, but you're trying to be like the natives and get native approval, versus it's just a wholehearted, like what the Arabs did, and kind of just change the landscape, you know, totally, and the culture. I forgot the text. Is written by an Asian Egyptologist, on the names amongst the Semites of the ancient Egyptians. So like a lot of the names that you even find in the biblical text of the Hebrews and just people in that area are in fact Egyptian names. And so you see that, you know, even the foreigners, they're adopting the culture and even the names, you know, of the Egyptians. And I always wondered, for example, like in terms of the relationship of the Cushites who came in during the 25th dynasty, that they didn't really impose like some other foreign language. Like you would think that this was an opportunity to introduce, you know, another language as the lingua franca, you know, of the area, but you don't even find that in the text. Matter of fact, even I think it's the Shabaka stone where the author, you know, argues that this was written previously and they're restoring it, but they called the original writers of the Shabaka stone their ancestors. You know, and so you wonder what's the nature of that relationship between this Cushitic group, not Cushitic in a linguistic sense, but the Cushites, you know, and the ancient Egyptians, that, you know, there was just no break in the language when they ruled, you know, at that particular time. Even though they were, you know, really kind of trying to restore more of the old Middle Kingdom,
which you see
type things at that period.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, we need to stop making this distinction as firm as it's kind of become between the two cultures. And, you know, I said this time and time again, you know, it seems that Egyptology is prepared to see, you know, one culture as kind of fully embedded in Africa and the other culture isn't, and that just doesn't work. How does that work? And that's problematic for all sorts of reasons.
What is your opinion on? Okay, well, what is your opinion on my opinion of the possibility that there were at least, at minimum, 2 different language groups that existed in Egypt in the different regions in pre-dynastic times. So like when you're talking about this unification of Upper and Lower Egypt, are we to assume that this was one homogenous group? Or do you find evidence, like I personally find evidence, because I look at it from a linguistic standpoint, but in your work, do you believe that there was at minimum 2 different groups that came together and created this ancient Egyptian society? And if so, what are the implications, of that particular thought?
Yeah, I mean, you're the linguist, not me. I think it would be wrong for me to comment on something that you research considerably, and I haven't. I think what we always need to remember in terms of language, just thinking more generally, is that often the written language bears less resemblance to the spoken language, and we don't have a record of that spoken language. So I think it's something that that we really need to take into consideration. I don't know if you've thought about that in terms of your research, or.
Yeah, I mean, there's ways for me that there's evidence. So like when you start seeing a lot of different words for body parts, kind of the basic vocabulary, like you have different words for sun, different words for head, hands, legs, stuff like this. This is evidence that there's multiple languages being spoken, in an area. But I guess not even from the linguistic standpoint. I know that, Egyptologists in general are familiar with this notion that, people in the Delta, couldn't necessarily, I forgot what story it is, that they couldn't understand the people in, Upper Egypt, which is our South, in our orientation. And so the assumption would be that, there are 2 different language groups that, that even you would have to have an interpreter to speak with someone in the Delta. But in my mind, it's also possible that, outside of just 2 indigenous groups that spoke 2 indigenous languages, something that I've been looking into is these foreign communities, settling, like how we would think of in the United States of like, a Chinatown, per se, like having like those foreign entities who would come and settle and create their own communities. Of course, they would be, speaking different languages there. And sometimes I think, like, we have the phrase called Spanglish, in the United States, where people speak Spanish and English in the same sentence. Like there's evidence that you see that even in the text. But yeah, I always, looked at that, in a very unique and possible way, that there was just different groups. And this may explain to a degree why there isn't a central religious tradition per se, that, it's really kind of pockets of their own thing going on in different regions.
Just thinking about the kind of regional religions, because there were sort of national religions, I guess, but there were also regional. And I think, again, it's really important to look at this from, an animistic sort of, and compare with other more traditional African religions, because, people were influenced very much by what was there. I mean, we travel around Egypt, perhaps not today so easily, but, we can travel quite quickly and easily. Some of these people, I suspect, would never have left their particular village or their region necessarily. And so I think that's probably why we end up with kind of sort of regional pockets as well, I guess, in terms of in terms of culture. So yeah, I guess your question is whether there were linguistic pockets as well. And when we compare to modern contemporary societies, that's kind of what we find, isn't it? So
yeah. We have this question, and I'm gonna get to Dr. Ortiz's question in a second. Okay, why isn't this? Okay. Dr. Ashton, Queen Tai's hair, as it is shown in artifacts, and her mummified body, would you say if she is an example of the different hair textures among the Africans of Kemet? Or
so we see quite a range, even in the period before we start to get sort of mass migration into Egypt. We see a range of different hair types. I think what I would say is that the hair types have more similarity to styles that we have with African type hair rather than European type hair, because of course the texture is different. So we see quite a range, as indeed you would in modern African, any modern African country or even cultural group as well, for that matter. So we see a range. I think what I would ask people not to do is to insist that there's one type that we consider African hair. I know when I worked on the hair combs project, I worked with colleagues and friends who are specialists in African type hair. And that was really informative, certainly for me. Obviously, I don't have that hair type. And it was a really important reminder about the range of curl pattern and type of hair. Yeah. So we do see a range.
I in my analysis of the word Kemet and all of the different debates surrounding that term, one of the things that I was forced to look at was the D3 Gardner sign list code hieroglyph that is, normally the classifier or determinative for the word Kim, meaning black. And so Kim meaning black usually has one of three determinatives: the Y1 abstract wrap glyph, the D3 hieroglyph, and then the three of the N33 kind of pellet circle glyphs. But when you're looking at the D3 glyph, they kind of really tell you in many respects. Now, I don't believe that they had our modern conceptualization of race and or whatnot, but they still give you clues in terms of who they are in that kind of physiological sense. Because when you look at the glyph, it is a strong curl pattern that is not like a straight like just straight down hair glyph. It is, and then you have variations of it, it's like D3A, how we code it in the modern times, but they're all this strong circular curly hair pattern. And I think that in itself is worthy of analysis. But I want to ask you, in addition, to commenting on that, what, because you said that the combs changed through the course of time. So, to what degree did they change, and what does that tell us in terms of the design of the combs?
Sure. So the very earliest combs are what we would kind of classify as a pick, and the earliest examples that I found were sort of around 5,500 years ago, 6,000 years ago. As we entered the kind of the New Kingdom, we kind of have gaps actually within the sort of comb chronology. but the combs actually change, and they actually look more like a sort of a standard kind of comb, except the gaps between the teeth are actually still quite wide. When we move on into the Roman period, and we have a lot of combs from tombs in the Roman period, they've changed completely. So the gaps are very narrow in the combs, and quite frankly wouldn't have been able to go through sort of coily or curly kind of hair without breaking either the combs. And of course, some of those combs would have been placed in tombs and may never have been used. So it's around that period. But what, interestingly, if we look further south, it's what is now kind of northern Sudan, the pick style of comb continues for much later than it does in what's now Egypt. So there is a difference there, and I suspect that difference is because from the sort of the Ptolemaic period into the Roman period, we have an influx of people from outside with different hair types. We know that those people often married Egyptians, Kemites, because we have documentation to show that they did. That they had children who had both languages and both cultures in the Ptolemaic period. So the combs are actually quite insightful. Really interesting for me was after I'd finished doing the comb project, I was in Ghana at the National Museum, and actually found combs that were identical to some of those very sort of early Egyptian Kemite hair combs. That had actually been found in a rubbish dump from an excavation dated to, I think they were the 18th century, sort of 1800s. So again, the parallels for each of the comb types that we have up until the Roman period, and then we find the same comb in the Roman period in Egypt as we do in other parts of the Roman Empire. So that's clearly a comb that the Romans use. But that prior to that, they're very different to anything else that we find in Europe.
Indeed. Okay, I'm probably asked 2 more questions, and then we'll. Hold on, is this showing up? How's this showing up on YouTube before it shows up here for me? So, Dr. Ortiz, in epistemological terms, what makes George G.M. James' work less credible, in your opinion, than centuries of observation biases in the Egyptological literature?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, and it's a very good point. And I would say that I'm highly critical of the other literature. And I think that there's a difference really in terms of, so quite often you will get a heavily referenced work with a Eurocentric perspective placed upon that work. And that's equally problematic, if not more problematic. My point is that when we are trying to readdress the balance, if you like, and resituate Kemet where, in my opinion, it should be, we shouldn't have to, but I personally feel, and this is probably because I'm an academic, I personally feel that we really need to put forward very strong arguments so that they can't just be dismissed. And I see a lot of this, somebody will raise a perfectly valid question to mainstream Egyptology, and it will just instantly get dismissed. If we go there with evidence and referenced evidence and are critical as well, then I think that puts us in a much stronger position if we want to start to readdress this balance.
Indeed. Before I ask the last question, I'm going to just make a few quick announcements. So on Thursday, we come back here and we are going to have as a guest Dr. Alexis Chingang, who is an anthropologist currently living in Belgium. And he is from the Daguerre people in, well, the Daguerre are kind of spread out, uh, between Burkina Faso, Cote d'Ivoire, and the northern part of Ghana. So he specifically is from northern Ghana, um, in that region of Daguerre people. So we'll be talking about his latest book, as well as his years of study as an anthropologist and, of course, an indigenous person of the Daguerre people. So it'd be good to get a different perspective of Daguerre religion and philosophy outside of Dr. Malidoma Some. And so this will be an interesting conversation. And so since he is in Belgium, we will also be doing another early show. So it will be at, in terms of East Coast time, it's going to be 10 a.m. East Coast time. And I think it'll be 4 p.m. Belgium time for those who are in Europe who may want to catch the live. So 10 a.m. Eastern time on Thursday, June the 11th. And we're going to have a double header. And so later on that afternoon or evening at 5 p.m. on 5 p.m. Eastern time, we will have Dr. Ifetayo Flannery, Africologist and psychologist, who is on the West Coast of the United States. I think it'll be 2 p.m. her time, LA time. And we'll be unpacking a variety of issues from an Afrocentric lens in terms of modern situations that are going on now, and how Africology can help us navigate, through these particular times. And so we still haven't solidified the date, but it will be sometime next week. We will have Dr. Abdul Bangura, who's many things. He has 3 master's degrees and 5 PhDs. So I really don't know what to call him, but he has a PhD in linguistics, computer science, mathematics, economics, and political science. And so we'll just be talking about everything under the sun when he comes on the show. But he'll be on sometime next week, and so be on the lookout for that. So, and he's out of Liberia. So whose question? We have mad questions. I don't want to hold you too long hostage, on the program. So we'll just have to invite you back sometime in the future so we can have some more in-depth conversation. So Emmanuel Adama asks, could you both, you and Dr. Ashton, recommend any books or articles that address the sociology of knowledge concerning Egyptology and African history in general? I have to think about that.
Yeah, I can certainly send some suggestions, but yeah, I'd have to have a think about that too.
All righty. Well, I just wanted to thank you very much for coming on the program and answering all our questions and giving us some insight into your world.
Thank you.
Both worlds, in Egyptology and how would you say the kind of psychology you're in again?
It's criminal psychology.
Criminal psychology, okay. And into the world of criminal psychology. It has been a blessing to have you here. And I'm pretty sure everyone listening live, and of course those who will catch the archives, enjoy your insights as well. So I recommend that everyone check out her website at kemetexpert.com. And well, here's a good question for you. Given that, that's your kind of main outlet to have conversations about Egyptology, are you going to create another site dedicated to subject matter in criminal psychology? Now
I
that
already
you're
have a blog, actually. So
oh,
it's
okay,
Juvenile Justice Psych, it's called.
Juvenile Justice Psych.
Yeah, so that explores specifically areas around kind of juvenile justice and includes my research. Yeah.
All righty. I appreciate it. Appreciate it. So thank everyone in the audience for listening. Do you have any last comments?
Just thank you for having me on your show, and thanks for all the questions. They're really interesting, and I think it's always great to have new questions because it makes you think about things differently. So that's great. So thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. And she has a Facebook public page.
Yeah.
Is it Kemet Expert on there too?
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So Kemet Expert on Facebook, so you can look her up there. And I'm pretty sure she is open to answering more questions.
Absolutely.
If you hit her up on that page. And so please if you are new to my channel, please subscribe, like and share, and keep these conversations going. And thank you again for coming on. And so I wish you well in Europe. You said earlier that y'all are still kind of in lockdown.
Yeah.
So I know everyone who writes, they've been taking this opportunity to kind of buckle down in their research.
Yeah.
So I'm pretty sure that's what you're doing as well. But thank you again, and everyone, y'all have a good night. And I'll just put this up and play some more music. So these are my places you can find me, and y'all be safe out there, and good night.